Welcome to this episode. Today we have somebody from the underground of the COVID wars, as I think posterity will call this. We have viral myalgia. Viral myalgia is clearly a pseudonym for someone who is I found on Twitter, and I think I'm on a daily basis stunned by the level of analysis and critical thinking that's going on in this anonymous account. And so I very quickly started following, and it's pretty clear to me that you know, viral has is months and months and months ahead of most folks in terms of even some of the smartest folks, and certainly maybe a year ahead of the CDC. So, welcome, Viral. Thank you for coming on. We had to have you on. We've been wanting to have you on for a while. So thanks for coming on.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you for having me.
So tell me what I mean. It's COVID. Your account is very data driven. Why be anonymous?
Oh, well, so starting in March of last year in 2020, when all of this policy stuff was coming down the pike, I had a very different view of how we should be approaching this. And I had sort of a different inferential stance on what we should be expecting. It wasn't very welcome. Interestingly, at the outset, I think people more and more open to opposing points of view, and then the environment just got crazier and crazier, to the extent that on certain Facebook groups of EM physicians, um, people were doxing me with divorce documents and other things, very personal stuff. And
I
I've gotten
bet.
remarried, and whatever, I have shared custody of the children with the ex. But this pattern repeated itself on Twitter, and it was pretty clear that rather than debate on matters of merit, it was better to just go after someone, and that was the sort of the currency of exchange. So I went anonymous.
Yeah, really nasty and nasty stuff. I'm sorry that that happened to you. But we are happy to have you, and like I said, you've been a wonderful follow on Twitter. Early on, what was the difference that you had? What are you referring to in terms of where
Right,
consensus was, and then where you were?
right. I would start with one of the things that has been, I would say, I don't know the correct word for this, violated the most is sort of the death of inference in all of this, meaning there's so much we don't know. By the way, I have a bit of a cold. I wasn't masking, obviously. Um, so the death of inference. And what do I mean by that? Meaning we were sold a particular bill from China and the WHO. And I don't know who to implicate here. I'm not going into any tinfoil hat conspiracies or anything here, but clearly we were told something different than was the case. I'm not talking about whether it's a lab leak or whether it was zoonotic in origin from a quote unquote wet market or what have you. I'm more talking about the fact that the spread started on X date. It went in these Y directions um, at this particular rate. None of these made particular sense, but um, we were acting as if all of it was true without at any point stopping to consider the alternate possibilities. So, and I could go into some more specifics, but just to keep it brief, I mean, if this was as contagious as billed with a 4% IFR and tens of millions of people leaving Wuhan before the lockdowns were instituted, we would have probably seen funeral pyres by satellite burning across much of India and parts of China, even though there wasn't huge population cross mixing from India to China. So it just, or in other countries as well, it just didn't make any sense.
So so you felt that it wasn't as certainly not as bad as some people were saying it was. And so you had did you have a different idea in terms of what we should do about it? I mean,
Yeah,
looking back
I
now.
didn't have epistemic closure.
Yeah.
In other words, I didn't have a strong prior as to what we would be experiencing. Not only that, but I was seeing plenty of influenza NAAT/PCR negative febrile ILI patients who, for all intents and purposes, were acting like influenza in February and even late January of 2020. And it was very clear that something different was going on. Didn't notice it as much in December, if I recall, but I haven't done an extensive review. I do know that Epic chart reviews of Seattle and LA demonstrated about a 40% spike in complaints of cough in December. What does that mean? It's all completely inferential, but inference is important, right? When you're dealing with uncertainty. And, there's so much we don't know is actually not accurate. There are a lot of things we do know. And part of what we do is we engage in cognitive heuristics all the time to simplify and categorize our world, sometimes in bad ways, but they actually also serve a purpose. And in this case, I think there was significant inference to be drawn from what were probable routes of spread. Where did the spread occur? When did it start? Et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of this, by the way, in retrospect, has been proven, right? We know that the seeding started in December and that it was spread well into 19 states by January, well before we could really do anything, so to speak. So, if the retrospectoscope has any value, stopping and actually taking some time to think about what was happening probably would have been to our benefit.
Any thoughts on what we should have done?
I will say, initially I was very much for masking and protecting essential workers. It seemed the data at the time suggested, well, these countries had lower incidence of disease. They were masking. Of course, the sort of quote unquote Asian ninja countries in that regard. That was the initial data, and it was sparse as it was, with almost zero priors. On top of that, there was also protecting essential workers. I thought it was important to not just physicians, by the way, I'm talking about all the low wage essential workers as well, and giving them basically government sponsored life and casualty insurance because society had to function. And sort of closing schools, I mean, 2 weeks, I'm not sure how that extended into months and a year and plus in most areas. So, my sort of prescription would have been a little bit much more simple. And as one mentor used to say, don't just do something, stop and stand there. So, I mean, just take some time, equipoise, to assess the situation more accurately.
So there's no point to travel bans, you think? I mean, looking back, should we have done that, or?
I still remember a first week of January, or it could have been, actually, I think it might have been middle December email from the CDC. One of the hospitals I work at is one of the main receiving facilities for a main port of entry on the West Coast. So we were notified to screen all passengers only on direct flights from Wuhan. If they connected from somewhere through Wuhan, that was okay. So it was pretty comical, right? Even from the get-go, it was pretty comical. I still have that email saved because it's a gem. But yeah, I think it was fairly obvious that spread would have occurred. I think subsequent IgG studies throughout Europe have confirmed that. Tracing studies in the US have confirmed that. I think the question really, honestly, the standing question, this is the tinfoil hat part of it, is how much before late 2019 did this start spreading? And I think that's an open question still.
Right. But, this idea that to give ourselves time to do something. We still don't know what that something is, but to keep things away for a little bit, to
Right.
allow the healthcare systems to, I don't know, build capacity that they don't seem to ever build, because we have to fill it up doing elective knee surgeries. I mean, that's what pays the
Yeah.
bills.
Yeah.
So
Exactly.
yeah, yeah, some old skeptical. But what is there anything to that to say? I mean, New Zealand and Australia seem to have a very low rate of COVID, and COVID causing significant morbidity. What's the should the U.S. I think that's the interesting thing. I feel like there's a fair number of folks in the United States, despite everything that's happened. I was actually on the, I was like, yeah, of course, it was a shut down travel. I mean, I have this thing coming
Right.
in, not thinking ahead to the fact that, well, okay, fine. Even if we shut down China soon enough, even if we shut down Europe soon enough, then, well, it's a pandemic. It's going to be everywhere. So it'll come through Mexico. It'll come through wherever.
Right.
It'll come through Canada. I mean,
Yeah.
how can we can't keep doing this whack-a-mole thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Um,
yeah,
well, I mean, I think that one of the things that's important to, so I'll say a couple things about sort of Oceania. I do think it's funny you asked me the question while trying to suppress a smile. Yeah. So, I mean, whatever, we can talk about how New Zealand is a country that's a 4 to 5 hour flight to its nearest neighbor, which is Australia, which itself is far removed from a host of other nations. So we can talk about that, and I think that there is some truth to that. I mean, the fact that if we go based on basic germ theory, it seems unlikely to have, if you don't have seeding, you're not going to have spread. So I get that. I think there are some questions around that, actually, and we can touch on that later if and when. But having said that, I think that looking at past pandemics is very helpful. And I don't know if you remember that thread I did, kind of doing sort of a numerical analysis in June of last year, looking at state outcomes, NPI stringency, and a few other things. But part of that thread was looking at prior pandemic literature and intercountry variability in outcomes. And intercountry variability in outcomes, even in, and I think this was referring specifically to 68 flu or 58 flu, I can't remember, they're about 74-fold, 70-fold. That's a huge delta, right? That's almost 2 orders of magnitude. So there are lots, and at the time when they were writing those papers and looking at the reasons why, it was attributed to a variety of issues. Some of it is just simple luck, right? Stockholm was seeded before the other Nordics. Stockholm is the most densely populated area in Sweden, et cetera, and the nursing homes are hit, et cetera, before people knew what was going on. Some of it was related to prior strains of influenza that had floated around, basically conferring partial immunity. Some of it was related to more intense prior flu seasons, the quote unquote infamous dry tinder sort of theory that's been floating around, so that susceptible populations were removed. And some of it was demographics, meaning depending on the age gradient of the strain in terms of who would affect, if there were people who were older who had seen prior strains and they had some quote unquote antigenic similarity to prior strains, they would have partial immunity. So there were a lot of variables that were recognized in other pandemics that created a lot of variability in outcome. And interestingly, in the prior flu pandemics of the 50s and 60s, it was Finland that had really bad outcomes and Sweden did really well. It's sort of the Nordic comparison. So I don't know what to say about that more than that. I mean, there are people, and maybe some of whom you follow on Twitter, who have some very interesting, unorthodox ways of thinking. I really resent the term at this point, conspiracy theorist. I'm interested in hearing the content of what people have to say and not ascribing labels to them. But people who talk about how the unusual influenza spike that Asia and Oceania, and particularly China and Oceania, saw in 2019 maybe means something. I don't know how you get a PCR primer that messes up skipping influenza, identifying something as influenza when the primer is so different. But I don't know. I don't know. They clearly had an influenza wave that was discordant from the rest of the world. That's for sure.
Yeah, that's a great point about how things are so variable, and everyone likes to use their pet theory to,
Yeah.
and certainly I've been susceptible. I was, and this is one of the things where you were actually, again, completely right. I don't know if that I don't know that you've actually been wrong about anything so far, but like I was really hoping that the fact that that the South, Florida and Texas, had kind of not borne a heavy brunt, and they had reached, I don't even know what the term
Mm.
is anymore, honestly,
Yeah, yeah,
population
yeah,
level,
yeah, yeah.
population level non-susceptibility, so,
Sure.
being not susceptible to some massive peak, which causes
Yeah,
hospitals
yeah,
to kind of,
yeah,
but unfortunately, that didn't happen. The summer
yeah.
saw,
Oh, I was wrong
Florida.
about that too. I
Yeah. So
expected.
how did you? So yeah. So summer saw Florida and Texas have a big
I
wave,
was.
which I was deeply disappointed about. I was like, man,
Yeah,
there goes this theory about staying open, and they had their
yeah.
infections, and it was kind of
Right,
spread out a little bit, and
right.
all that stuff. But no, unfortunately, they had a large wave after
Yeah.
that. But you were pretty confident very early on that this was going to happen. How did you know that
Well, I
if you
mean,
pieced that together?
I figured it would happen. I think what I was surprised by was the amplitude. I wasn't surprised that it happened, and that's just because the patterns had began to emerge, and it was pretty clear that, I mean, come on, we don't go through influenza waves annually because we hit some kind of herd immunity threshold and then it goes away. That's comical. That doesn't happen. So when we had our dip in January, I still remember this, and everyone was super excited about the vaccine rollout causing this tremendous dip in
Yeah.
cases. We were vaccinating at less than 1%. Maybe it was like 1%. I can't even remember. And clearly it wasn't the inauguration, or it could be. I don't know. But the point is that it again, it's just this premature epistemic closure that occurred over and over and over again since last year is possibly the most irritating aspect of all of this. People who seem, and I'm using the word seem, before I would have said should, now I'll say seem like they should have had the intellectual and intellectual credential and domain expertise to not engage in this process, repeatedly engage in this process. And I don't understand why. Yes, politics, sure, whatever. But at some point, wouldn't your pride just stop you from wanting to be serially wrong? I don't get it.
but what you said yourself, you were surprised by the amplitude, and I think that's what was that's what was surprising to me as well, this severe surge
Yeah.
that kind of stretched hospitals. You very early on were talking about seasonality, right? And again, most of the,
Not that I
and
know what
honestly,
that means, by the way. I'm not claiming to know what constitutes that at all.
right.
It's just patterns.
Right. And I guess you were using historical context to say that it's a respiratory virus. Respiratory viruses are seasonal, and
Yeah.
that's why something like this will happen. Is that what you know? Is that why you think that this will kind of seasonal? That it is seasonal, and that these waves will kind of keep coming and going.
I think the amplitude will blunt out. I mean, this is a pure speculation, but whatever number of thousands of years ago when influenza entered into human circulation, this is probably how it hit. It probably devastated a lot, and it took about 3 years for things to peter out and reach some kind of equilibrium. New susceptibles enter the population. Those susceptibles get claimed with some probability every year. And so there will be quote unquote peaks every year, just like we have influenza peaks every year. But it'll be at some equilibrium until, if and when, there's a big antigenic shift, right?
Yeah.
And so,
Right.
I think that, the Florida thing, I have to say that I think that I put a lot more faith in vaccines at that point, and I thought they would have a much bigger impact. People are very, Twitter in particular, but reflects the national media, was kind of hammering away on low vaccination rates in Florida, and definitely other parts of the South were definitely lower, but Florida was not a low vaccination rate state compared to other southern states. That's patently untrue. Their vaccination rate is significantly more higher than Michigan's, and not all that different from California in the most susceptible populations. So, and possibly even better actually in the older groups. So the question then became, damn, why aren't these working as advertised? And and then that's when I started digging into the trial data a bit more. And,
Yeah. So
yeah.
right. So right. Actually, I was going to say. I mean, it was obvious to the media and then the Twitterati that Florida and Texas were imploding because
Moral
they had
failure.
a
Yes,
they
moral
had
failure.
yeah,
Right.
they're full of MAGA hat wearing folks that were having
Right.
orgies together and
Right. Right.
doing their
They
super
can do
spreader
barbecue,
things.
but they can't mask. I got it. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not masking, keeping the schools open, all those things are doing. Never
Right.
mind that the schools, the school and mask, mandates and stuff that they had, you know, existed, what's from October, November or whatnot. So,
Right. Right.
tell me about the vaccines.
Well,
So how so your thinking on vaccines kind of shifted based on what
yeah.
you saw in Florida. But so tell me a little bit more about that and what you kind of looked into the trials a little bit more and what you thought.
So I think I just have to back up for a moment and talk about how none of this was stuff that I ever really doubted. Meaning, my kids are fully vaccinated. My teen has had one COVID vaccine. Um, my 2-year-old hasn't, and if and when it's appropriate, we can talk about it. What my preferences are on that. But I I believe in vaccination. At the turn of the century, childhood mortality before the age of 5 was 50%. When I talk about the 1900s, and so it was clearly infectious disease was claiming a large portion of the lives. I'm also well aware of the fact that one of the biggest improvements in mortality around the world really has been civil engineering and sanitation. That's been a huge step, and probably the next one is penicillin. You can kind of visualize these um, sort of what I would call it descents in mortality globally at these sort of interventions. It's pretty interesting when people have kind of looked at this. That being said, um, I do febrile infant workups all the time, and I see how they've evolved over 80 plus over since the 80s in terms of what I do and what I don't do. And clearly, with the advent of, and I've seen it in my career, the advent of HIB and the pneumococcal vaccines has made a big difference in terms of how we manage febrile infants and the risk of occult bacteremia. So clearly, and clearly for a large number of cases, even within the course of my career, their impact is measurable and appears to be quite dramatic, at least in terms of morbidity. Now, having said that, I'm also aware of the fact that while I get my flu vaccine every year, including this year, and even last year when there was none, um, I know that the net value of the flu vaccine has been a topic of debate for decades, right? Meaning people have tried to look at this in 10 different ways. And the most definitive statements that can be made are that it seems to reduce disease severity in hospital stays and maybe days of work missed. But the net mortality benefit, even if you look at the over 65 group alone, is not huge. It appears to be somewhere in the single digits, and it does not appear to be over 10%. And I kind of point to this Kaiser analysis as my favorite one because they had vaccination rates well in north of 70% in the over 65 group. As you know, it's an integrated IDN with incredible data tracking, and they also have an incredible research network attached to Kaiser. And when they looked at this question, they came out with an estimate of about a 4.2 to 4.6% reduction in mortality in the over 65 age group. So, after looking at this, I'm like, well, is that what we have here? Is that, and it seems that honestly, that kind of is what we have here. We have a disease severity modifier, which has great value in certain people, but its population benefit may be very difficult to measure because in a mass vaccination, you're not targeting only the susceptibles.
the so so you think that I mean, uh, obviously the trials, the RCTs that are in the New England Journal show a significant reduction
Severe COVID, absolutely,
in symptomatic COVID. Do you have an
absolutely.
issue with how those trials? I mean, I think this is
Yeah.
important to flesh out because certainly a lot of folks, a lot of skeptics, don't have a lot of issues with how the trial was designed. There was a blinding period,
Yeah.
2 weeks after.
Yeah.
Did you have any issues with that?
No, no,
How
I
any
don't
of that
have
was
any
done?
issues
Yeah.
with the trial at all. I think there are a couple of questions that are difficult to answer now that we're seeing just how robust prior infection is. Now that we have a much better handle on the fact that you can have prior infection with immune activation, so-called T cell amplification without seroconversion of a prior positive test, that can actually reduce your risk of disease. Now that we see these things, I think there are probably some questions about the populations in the trials, but one would assume that if all other demographics are balanced, those sorts of potential confounders would be equally balanced in the arm. So I don't have any issue with that.
Right.
I think what is interesting is that in the end, looking at the Pfizer trial, if severe COVID was reduced, which it was, and they showed that within 30 days, right? Within 30 days, a reduction in severe or symptomatic COVID, they were underpowered to demonstrate a mortality benefit. It just wasn't demonstrated. So why? Well, one of two possibilities. One, um, there isn't one, and two, there is one because we're seeing a reduced severe COVID. How could there not be? So it must be underpowered, right? So that's that's kind of, I think the latter is kind of where I stand. And what's interesting, as I would say, is that it's underpowered for a trial of mass vaccination. And let me explain what I mean. If we were to, for example, just recruit high risk people above a certain age, children with comorbidities, and this in particular, obese or immunocompromised, I think you'd see a vastly different result. I think you'd see a clear mortality benefit with the reduction of severe COVID. And that's, of course, just a guess, but this is based upon reasonable inference from what we see in terms of risk modifiers for disease.
Wait. So again, 20,000 people, around 20,000 people in each arm.
Yeah,
The difference is, eight cases of symptomatic COVID in the treatment arm, with the vaccine.
right,
This is the Pfizer vaccine, and 160 cases in the
right,
control arm. Why would it be a week? And again, this
right.
is being done at a time where there's no question in most doctors who treat this that this is certainly a severe illness that in a certain group of population, a
Yeah,
certain group high risk folks, it progresses to, a severe COVID ARDS like
right,
condition that can be
right.
generally fatal or have high morbidity at that point. So why is it a weak leap to go from, okay, if you're reducing symptomatic COVID by this significant amount, that you're not also going to reduce severe disease and therefore
Oh,
mortality.
I don't think that's a bad leap at all. My point is, it just commenting on the trials themselves, they were underpowered to demonstrate that numerically. That's the
Mm,
only point.
I see.
Yeah, but what is the issue right now in terms of the course of the pandemic as of today that we're sort of debating here? Is it that
Right.
it's continued? That I mean, on the one hand, hasn't it been? I mean, I'm not in the weeds of these things, so I'm going to rely on you to tell me, to orient me a little bit. Can't we say that the epidemic, in a certain sense, or the pandemic has been defanged of its really most lethal aspects? And then is the question, what do we attribute this defanging to? Or do we say that still, no, mortality is still very, very high, and therefore, really, despite the vaccines and whatnot, that there's still perhaps not a great effectiveness of vaccines at reducing mortality. So how should we read this? And then, of course, there's the delta and the whatnot, and all these variables that change.
I mean, I would read this as, yes, the pandemic has been defanged. It has been for a while, even in the severe Delta wave in the South. While we saw many breathless articles about what was happening at hospitals, ultimately they handled it. That's why we have hospitals, by the way, to handle sick people, just to be clear. And so, you know, I think that it was, and it is largely defanged. And I think it's through a combination of vaccination and infection. And it's not clear why in the conversation, and I'm not saying you're doing this, but you see this a lot where people don't want to acknowledge the role of infection, prior infection. It's bizarre, absolutely bizarre, because it's clearly robust on orders, and maybe not an order of magnitude more than vaccination, but at least a 3 to 4 fold. And it's pretty consistent reduction in terms of reinfection risk, just reinfection as defined by a positive test, by the way. I'm not even talking about outcomes. So why can't we have that discussion? You know, to have that discussion doesn't mean you are endorsing someone to go to a COVID party, right? To make that leap is a very different leap, and people seem incapable intellectually of separating the two, and I don't understand that at all. So yes, it's defanged. It's defanged for a number of reasons, but it's important to recognize all the components.
All right, and not sort of put all the causes in one basket, so to speak.
But this idea that the study is not powered to demonstrate that, right? I mean, again, it's a 40,000 patient trial in the midst of a raging pandemic. Whatever. But are you, so if it's not powered, then you had to do something to increase power. So did they not enroll enough sick patient, enough high risk patients? Meaning, did they basically had too high? But then, Viral, here's the question then, right? If you can show in a lower risk population, say, right? Ideally you do this in over 75 nursing home residents only or something like that, right? But if you're designing the trial, do you necessarily want to design a trial in that group and give 20,000 of that group a placebo? Versus, meaning, again, I'm asking, you're going to have to make some. We spent 2 hours with Dr. Avalik on the Bangladesh mass study talking about all the various assumptions made. You're going to have to make some.
Last night, by the way.
Oh, okay, good. It's probably a cure for some insomnia, perhaps. but why is it not reasonable to say if you're reducing symptomatic transmissions? Sorry, not symptomatic. It's not transmission. Forget that. That's a whole other ballgame. If you're reducing symptomatic COVID in a lower risk cohort, and okay, fine, you're not getting hospitalization mortality endpoint data because they're lower risk. Why can we not extrapolate that to our over 75 nursing home / high risk population?
Oh, well, I mean, I think you know as well as I do that the immune responses aren't going to be similar across different population cohorts. They never have been for any variety of vaccines. And that's part of why certain people are more in cohorts are more susceptible to certain infection, et cetera. I mean, even the notion, clinical frailty has been an underappreciated component in all of this. So age, morbid obesity, and then organ transplant status. Those are the 3 major risk modifiers that have repeatedly come out.
Okay.
That being said, within that group, 1/3 of sort of very clinically frail folks who live in long-term care facilities are under the age of 65.
Right.
So it's complicated.
Right. Yep. So no, it's such a great point. The fact that, it seemed a reasonable assumption to me at the time that just run a trial with as many people as you can, enroll quickly, right? Enrolling quickly, getting it done quickly, to get a vaccine out, to show it's safe, do it, reduce symptomatic events, and yes, that's a reasonable surrogate. But you bring up an awesome, what you and others brought up, and Peter Doshi, wrote I think something in the BMJ about it. He's a pharmacist that writes for the BMJ, I believe, about the fact that this was not the endpoint was not mortality, hospitalization, these important endpoints. and that you couldn't rule out the fact that this was not as effective as it is being advertised, right?
Yeah.
So
And you know what? That's okay.
right, yep, exactly.
That's
But it may mean
it's okay to
right,
say that this
right,
really doesn't seem to have the value we thought it would for a niche,
right,
but it really has value for this whole cohort.
right,
That's
right,
okay.
right.
But
And being epistemically closed would be like to be no, bat in the hatches
no,
and
no,
say
no,
no,
stop
it's
saying
definitely
that.
awesome. Right,
Like,
right,
stop saying that. You know,
yeah,
cross yourself, do something, whip yourself. I mean,
right,
it's
right,
what is that?
right. It could be that you need a higher dose, right?
I don't
in
know.
in
I mean,
folks that are older. We don't know. You're right.
well, we
You're
have
right.
seen with the Moderna vaccine that the
Right.
rate of waning is lower than the Pfizer
Right.
vaccine. It's
Yep.
contributed to dosing. But you know what?
Right.
There's a cost with that. There's a higher rate of GBS. There's a higher rate of myocarditis. It's not as if it's like, it's shocking apparently in life that it's like people who say like, this test is more sensitive and more specific. It's like, really? Like, well, show me a test that's done that. I really want to see this test. Right? So yeah, I mean, it occasionally happens, but it's rare.
So what do you think based on, and again, we only really have the Israelis to go off. No, not our CDC. God forbid. A country of, I don't know what Israel is, what 15 million people. I don't know. It's like the size of Philadelphia.
It's like the size of a Pfizer lab.
Right, the size of a Pfizer lab. So what, I mean, I thought this is a nice segue into natural immunity and whatnot. But I thought the preprint that came out a few days ago, again, from that Israeli Ministry of Health, which looked at folks that were double vaxxed, folks that were boosted, folks that were recovered, all combinations of such. What a beautiful little paper. Again, lots of caveats and stuff. It's not
these are not
RCT and
complicated
stuff.
statistics, Anish. Let's be honest.
Right.
These are not. These are simple numerators, denominators,
right.
case rates. There's nothing complicated here. You don't have to talk about fixed effects and random effects in this particular calculation. It's very straightforward, and it's consistent. So one of the things that came up a lot is internal external validity. This has a lot of not just internal validity, but external validity in terms of Qatar and Lombardy data and even PHE data. It's replicable. The only place that doesn't seem to be able to replicate this is the CDC. It's amazing.
So one of the fascinating things in that Israeli preprint on showing all this, and the only little slight complicating thing here is that you just have to make sure people know that the denominators differ in all these groups, right? So they have this. So in all these groups, and the groups they have are the recovered, the boosted, the vaccinated, the recovered then vaccinated, and the vaccinated then recovered. So those are the 5 distinct groups they have. And and getting to this point about, well, how efficacious really are the vaccines in preventing severe illness, right? I was really struck by the vaccinated group. Right, this is the largest group, the vaccinated group, and in the 60+ group, they had 13,000 infections in the 60+ group, and 1,000 of those were severe COVID. So double vaxxed, and I remember asking Ran Israeli, who's another great follow, who puts out a bunch of great stuff. He's like right up on it in terms of releasing some of this stuff. I remember early on him talking about the fact that they were what the severe COVID that definition was the real thing. It wasn't if you had a fever, you're severe COVID in Israel. It's the real thing. So, but that was surprising to me, right? Because that certainly was not what I was telling my patients that I was vaccinating, who were high risk, mostly over 60, right? I was telling them that the chances of you getting severe COVID are next to nil. Right. This is certainly, I'm sure, better than an unvaxxed person. But certainly not what we thought early on. So that was probably a leap too far to make to say that.
It was, and I think it's interesting. So like in chats at the time the vaccines were rolled out, my whole point was I hate the word anti-vaxxer. It's so stupid. It's about the same as anti-masker, COVID denier. It's just dumb. It's just fundamentally, my feeling on it was okay, well, let's see how this vaccine performs in the field, because if you haven't seen discrepancies between lab or trial and real world deployment, that's because you don't know what you don't know.
Right.
So my feeling was it's highly unlikely that this is going to take someone who has a BMI of 40 and be quote unquote 95% effective on them. It just, that doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
Maybe it's because the needle can't get into the muscle, whatever. I'm kidding, of course. But the point is that, you know, there may be any number of reasons, but that doesn't seem correct. That ultimately this will still remain an issue of rational risk assessment, which has been, by the way, the other big death in all of this is sort of rational risk analysis.
Yeah.
So, anyway.
So you think so that may help explain, you know, what happened in Florida, what happened in Texas, and what may happen in the Northeast, or, you know, certainly apparently Michigan for some reason. I don't know what's going on there. They seem to be hit. They seem to be very hard.
But the narrative is that all these were unvaccinated, right? I mean, all these hospitalizations. How
well,
much?
I mean, it does seem, and you know, you're a very busy clinician as well, Viral. It does seem that we should be clear about that point. It does still seem that the majority of folks that end up hospitalized, at least in my real world experience and what we're seeing in a bunch of hospitals, is that it's the unvaccinated that end up hospitalized, as well as folks that are super high risk, like an 85-year-old with lymphoma that's been double vaxxed. Yeah.
So in my experience, I need to be careful because, and I am careful about it, but the counties where I practice, the vaccination rates are north of 92%, right? So, of course, the people I'm admitting are vaccinated. That's just what's going to happen.
Right.
And yes, I admit the occasional unvaccinated because they represent less than 10% of the population in my area. So, yeah, it's going to be a function of
Actually,
what I meant, Michelle.
I get the census. Yeah.
What I meant, Michelle, in answer to what you're saying is that so yes, the folks. Yes, the vaccine is effective. Yes, the folks being hospitalized are unvaccinated. But, you know, if you get to a certain level, the thought was that if you get a certain level of recovered plus vaccinated, right, there isn't enough of virus in the whole, you know, little sphere that you live in that should be getting to these high risk folks, or should be even getting to the unvaccinated folks, right? So the idea is that if you're at 65% vaccinated, and you're at, you know, whatever percent is recovered, then they're just you should be at a level where you're not that susceptible to then getting, you know, hit hard. But unfortunately, you know, clearly, if the if the vaccine can still, you know, in high risk people give you a fair number of severe infections, then there's still enough of a viral load around to, you know, to get to all those little communities which are the highest risk, which would be the unvaccinated and the high risk. So that's my
and then to be clear, I mean, I don't know how scientific it is, but I get census, the right hospital census, a couple of hospitals, you know, private hospitals. My impression in the summer wave last summer was that actually it was maybe a third were vaccinated. You know, I mean, clearly the majority were unvaccinated, but it wasn't an overwhelming vaccine. You know,
yeah, so and I think that's about right.
Right.
I mean, again, in my county, it was, I don't know, more like maybe 60%. But again, it's because we're such a heavily vaccinated county. It just that's why.
Right.
So why? And again, the same Israeli preprint that I keep. I'm going to get off of it in a second. Keep perseverating on is that, you know, if you look at the hybrid of recovered and vaccinated, or vaccinated and recovered, you know how I was giving you those numbers of you know, 1,000 severe infections in the vaxxed only group.
Yeah.
Holy cannoli! In the recovered and vaccinated and recovered group, you know, the over 60 I'm reading right now, there's 7. Severe COVID infections, and in the other they're 5. I mean, the differential is big. Now, again, the denominators are different, like the denominator. So
those are all rates. So
Right. So it seems but yet in the national landscape, and to this day, you know, our public health officials and, you know, all the smart people that, you know, also are, you know, lockstep with Eric Ding, they all seem to downplay natural immunity or having recovered from infection. Why is that?
Yeah, so one thing I try not to do is use the word natural immunity. I just say prior infection. I don't want it
Right.
to seem like I'm an osteopath and I shouldn't say a homeopath. That's the right word. So like, I'm not trying to cure you with herbs, although probably some of the herbs might be very effective compared to certain drugs that have been bandied around. So having said that, I don't understand that. And the best way I can phrase it is somehow, the goal of vaccination is harm reduction. That's the goal. The goal of vaccination is not vaccination, right? So if you focus on harm reduction, which is the public health endpoint, then you decide who needs to be vaccinated and who doesn't. It doesn't become a point of discussion. It's the same thing with masks, obviously, and I'm sure we'll get to that at some point. But it's not about the mask, right? It's not about wearing the thing. It's about the dogmatic insistence around it that it's this incredibly efficacious intervention, and eschewing the intervention is a moral failure. And the same sort of logical progression has been applied to vaccination as well. So let me look at it this way. So like I admitted I saw a lady the other night, 38-year-old in my area. I don't know how she's older, like late 30s maybe, but young, healthy, slim. And of course she works in a setting with kids. I'll just leave it at that without getting too specific. And she was unvaccinated and she had COVID. And so there were several doctors in the area like, oh my God, this irresponsible person, this person did this, X, Y, and Z, and yada, 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 and yada. And I'm like, she's fine. And it's clearly not stopping transmission. If it wasn't her, it would be someone else. Why the outrage? Just treat her. Just be calm and treat her. She's fine. And then I had another lady in her 70s who was heavyset, had other medical issues, who chose not to get vaccinated. And I'm like, well, let's talk a little bit about that. I was admitting her for something completely unrelated. And so I talked to her about it and I said, this is these are the numbers, these are the risk ratios. This is why it makes sense for you to consider doing this. Yeah, ultimately you will probably, if not may, get infected, but your body will handle it in a gentler way. But of course, when I talk to the hospitalist and talk about this unvaccinated patient, there's just like this 5-minute stream of vitriol that pours out, and I'm like, do you think that's going to be effective?
Yeah, it's a really terrible thing that we've done. What is your thoughts on, before we move off the vaccines? What are your thoughts on the safety of the vaccines?
Again, I think this is one of those areas where it's, again, premature epistemic closure. I think the discussion around myocarditis is weird. And what I mean by that is that you probably saw my thread back in May where I kind of went through VAERS and I kind of programmatically selected out things and manually verified. It was very early signal, just a month into 16, 17-year-old. And I wanted to say, hey, like, what are we really looking at here? Is this real? And it was real. And it wasn't just myocarditis, by the way. Okay. And just the fact that that's just dominated the conversation, I think is weird, because ultimately the myocarditis risk versus the COVID risk, the differences, these are micromorts in differences, millions of death risk in differences. And or definitely thousands, right? But the point is that there are not huge differences here where we can sit here and we can try and create a complex decision analytics scenario and do some micro simulation and decide that this one strategy is a little bit more, a little bit better than this. But for the individual patient, as you know, the outcome is what? Binary, right? So ultimately at the population level, we can have this discussion and come up with some kind of policy. But ultimately, people need to make the decision that they're comfortable with, and that's okay. And either way they go on this, as long as they understand the different risk ratios that are brought in their particular case, it's not an unreasonable decision in a certain set of demographics, and a pretty large set of demographics, actually. What I find problematic is there's a host of other things that are not being properly discussed. And let me give you an example. So I saw quite a bit of Bell's palsy. Is Bell's palsy something that ends someone's life? Of course not. Does all Bell's palsy recover? No, it doesn't. Okay, it does not. A significant portion continue to have a deficit. So if I'm some 20-year-old and I'm slim, athletic, and healthy, and I get the Moderna vaccine or the Pfizer vaccine, I'm just going to be honest, these complications are more common with the higher dose Moderna vaccine. I hope I don't get sued, but anyway, so it's, and you walk out with, as a 20-year-old, a Bell's palsy with an ongoing 30% deficit. What does that mean for your quality of life? I mean, I don't think it's fair to minimize that. And so now I've chosen something that's not life-threatening on purpose, but now let me talk about something else that is potentially concerning. I have a friend whose early 20-something sister got COVID. She is morbidly obese. So she had a significant difficulty with it and had some ongoing anosmia. And within weeks of that, she was vaccinated. She went on to develop Guillain-Barré. And now 6 months later is still struggling to walk. That's a big deal. And for someone to say that they did their part for society when we're clearly not stopping transmission, for that to have been a potentially this all happened before it was mandated, but let's say that happened in a mandate situation. That's a big deal. We need to have that conversation. And the fact that the manufacturers are completely indemnified within this is also a problem if you're going to issue a mandate like this for these folks that necessarily wouldn't have had a severe outcome from COVID. And especially in this case, someone who's infected and recovered, which we know carries a higher risk profile for adverse events. Why are we doing that?
I don't know, Viral. Why are we doing that? Why is there this?
No, but first of all, that's a good point that I wasn't necessarily. I don't know how many people are aware of that. I wasn't aware of it. That the adverse effect profile is higher post in recovered patients.
Yeah. So even after the first shot, now, in most cases, they're more likely to have a fever and aches and the dwindles or what have you, things that are transient and of no big deal. But occasionally, it is a big deal. Right? It is a big deal. And so, how many 20-year-olds need to be injured for you to think it's a big deal? I don't know the answer to that question. I just know that it's a conversation that's important to have. And it's important enough to make sure that if you're going to walk forward and deliver with declarative certainty that this person is going to get this vaccine for society's good, or the alternative is for them to not have a job and exit functioning society, you better be damn sure that what you're giving them is as safe as it could possibly be and is given in the most appropriate scenario. And if something happens to them, they are protected and taken care of. I don't think we've done a single one of those things.
Clearly not. And, I mean, from the get-go, I keep harping on the fact that it's in the nature of public health as it is understood that, those things are not going to happen.
Yeah.
And it's not new. In fact, if you look at the, public health has taken all the steps in the last 40 years to prevent this from happening, to protect itself, to protect, again, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but it's hard not to think in those terms. At the end of the day, when you see sort of how things have evolved and are evolving, and so I tend not to be a conspiracy theorist. I think it's more of a psychological thing. In people who are in positions of authority like this, they over time will end up protecting themselves. And bureaucracies protect themselves. Bureaucracies have to have their they have to deal with the identity crisis, right? They have to justify their existence and whatnot, and that's going to push them in the trend of being more and more radical, because really it's a radical position that they're taking, and subjecting the country to.
Yeah, I don't understand. I don't understand it, because I think for me, as I said, at some point, I would just be tired of being wrong. Like, just
Yeah,
objective.
but they can afford it. I mean, they've protected them, right? Somehow they have the media on their side, right? They have the politicians on their side, and
But I
they're
think what's,
immune. They're immune. They have
yeah, I
built-in
mean,
immunity.
I think that's true to some degree. I think that one of the saddest things I've witnessed in all this is watching my colleagues get most of their scientific and medical education from CNN, MSNBC, Fox, or the New York Times, or whatever, instead of actually taking some time to do some primary research, reading some preprints. Like, if we were all taught to read the literature, some of us were better at it than others, some of us enjoyed it more. Um, but we were taught that for a reason, meaning things are evolving, things are worth learning, you need to critically evaluate things. And it seems like most practicing physicians have forgotten that part of their training was scientific and critical thinking. I really do feel like that.
Well, part of the problem with with many of the outlets that you're talking about, all the outlets really, that the mainstream legacy media, is that they get their information from the same source, right? And that source in this case is, I mean, the CDC director. The CDC director yesterday just said that COVID-19 vaccines are safe for children 5 to 11, which, I mean, sure. I mean, they are safe based on a trial that was, 2,400, 2,500
Right.
patients. Now, I guess it's been a few months now since that was rolled out, and you have, I guess, the CDC has safety data on
Right.
the lower doses that have been given to that age group, and I'm
Right.
sure they're monitoring very carefully for that. But she goes on to say they have undergone the most comprehensive and intense safety monitoring system in U.S. history. To date, no serious safety concerns have been identified. And there's not. Well, I'll say, what do you think? What do you think of that statement?
I mean, I mean, you saw the power analysis I did in my thread way back in May of this year. I mean, the 16 to 17-year-old trials were horribly underpowered. I do think the lower dose is interesting, and I hope that it has some beneficial impacts. And what's more interesting about it is maybe a lower dose is appropriate for young adults. Maybe a lower dose is important, is appropriate for young folks, say anyone under the age of 40 who's slim. I don't know. I'm just putting things out there, because ultimately, why wouldn't you want to minimize iatrogenia whenever possible?
Right.
And so, these people who are at very low risk of severe COVID, maybe giving them just a whiff, giving their immune system a whiff without a large dose of the LNPs, which we're still exploring as to what they do and why they do what they do. Or
it's the lipid nanoparticles that the mRNA
Yeah, I don't know. And there's things like, there's another classic example, like a couple of months back, there was a Pfizer sponsored paper that put out this sort of exciting result that, up to 4 months after delivery of the vaccine, exosomes with spike protein were floating around in the blood. And they think, this is great. This is a great way for ongoing immunogenicity. And I'm sitting there thinking, I'm no microbiologist, but why are there exosomes floating around with spike 4 months after this mRNA vaccine is delivered? mRNA is long since gone. What's going on? Don't you want to know? Right? Don't you want to know? And and even after you look at the supplements for the Pfizer trial, and you look at the lymphopenia that occurs in the first 3 days and mostly in the first 2 weeks, that does appear somewhat dose dependent. What is that? I mean, I know we've seen it with some other vaccines, but this has been discussed a little bit as to how after the initial vaccine, people are, the vaccine efficacy is about 40% lower in that first 14 days. And is that because they don't have a good immune response? Or is there something else happening in terms of downward immunomodulation, making them susceptible to things? You know, one of the things that's kind of interesting as well, and just discussing it with some other Twitter folks, is, you know, the mean days to appendicitis onset in placebo versus treatment arms. It's like 22 days versus 50 days. That's interesting. What's going on?
In terms of her tweet, sorry, in terms of her, you know, what she said, I mean, I just, the historical context, of course, is that, you know, in the polio vaccine trials in the 1950s, there were 650,000 children who got polio vaccine or placebo. And then there were another 1.2 million other kids who received no injection, but, you know, they were in another unmonitored control group. So that's the context which she's saying that, you know, this is the most, you know, we've done the most work ever here on this vaccine, when, you know, the RCT here is 2,400 patients. Now, Paul Offit, who we had, you know, was gracious enough to come on earlier, would argue that, you know, doing a trial of that size with this particular illness would be unethical, because you don't want that many kids in a placebo arm of this trial, because, you know, he points out, well, there was a cost to putting 600, you know, 300,000 kids in a placebo arm in polio. So, you know, that would be the rejoinder. But yeah, it certainly seems. I mean, I don't know. I worry that our leaders don't quite have the historical context, or I don't know what, to kind of
I've kind of had,
why would they say these things in this way?
I've had some spicy tweets to this extent, to this point, where I've kind of said, like, you know, these people don't really seem to know their own literature. And I really mean that. I mean, it's not like I'm in the lab or I'm running some primary literature here. I'm just doing literature searches and reading. I'm not doing anything fancy here. And so I think it seems reasonable to ask that the people who guide policy do at least what I do, at least, right? And if they don't have the numerical skills, that they at least have people around them, of which, how many employees are at the CDC again? 20 or 40,000? I don't know. Someone in there has got to have some experience with basic stats, right? And they can help these people if they're not numerically enabled to do it themselves.
Are you worried about the data analysts that are are out on Twitter, in terms of the pure data analysts who are, you know, who don't have kind of the medical background that you have? That you know, for instance, a lot of folks are very, very upset about the blinding. This is why I mentioned it again: the fact that 14 days after the vaccine, the vaccine or placebo was given, there was a certain amount of time where you were blind, and then after that, you know, it was up to the clinician's discretion about whether or not a COVID test was to be ordered or not. And again, you know, there are reasons you do that, right? You don't, you know, I don't necessarily care about an asymptomatic person as much as asymptomatic positive versus a symptomatic positive. And then there's issues with, you know, right after you get a shot, you know, if you have an initial vaccine reaction, do you necessarily want to be running to get a COVID test just for that? You know, it kind of dirties that. So I can see why there'd be some period of blinding afterwards. But as you said before, you know, one of the things that I think people may not understand, I don't know, it may not quite get, is that, okay, even if you disagree with this and you think that's what's causing, you know, that's why the trials are fundamentally flawed, the idea was that these folks were randomized to these two groups, right? So you'd have to have some type of bias to explain that huge significant difference between 160 in one and 8 only on the other. So you're basically saying it has to be fraud.
So now I don't have a problem with the structure of the trial. I don't have a problem with how they went about it. I don't have a problem with the trial. In fact, when I talk about it, I talk about the results from the trial. I don't criticize the trial. And the results are what you need to focus on. And I think they're very informative.
But as you're saying, you need a really robust structure, and you need folks curious and interested and looking, that aren't just into the ends, the ends justifying the means,
Right.
to kind of look for safety signals and not be afraid to talk about those safety signals if they come up. But the problem is that if you're committed to a world where 100% of folks need to be vaccinated in order to get to your goal of whatever, then you can't talk about the safety signals, because the moment you mention them, you get inundated with, you're basically, a bad person and you may be considered anti-vax. So for instance, the J&J vaccine, that, there was a pause
Right.
after, to investigate the vaccine-induced thrombosis thrombocytopenia,
Yeah.
VITT that was occurring, especially in higher rates in young women, right? And my God, the public health infrastructure on Twitter really like opened up a can of
Right.
on the CDC, et cetera, for even putting that pause, because that said, oh my God, you're going to increase vaccine hesitancy by doing that. So that's the kind of climate we're in, where like they just blatantly ignore these things. So
yeah, I don't it's pretty clear that more transparency is better for trust. It's pretty clear that when you approach a patient who is hesitant without judgment, that you're more likely to succeed. I mean, that's just what I've experienced in practice. This isn't
right.
This isn't Twitter.
Yeah. Besides the transparency and the analysis of the trials and being objective and all that, I'd like to have your opinion on. You mentioned a few minutes ago some biological oddities that are unexplained right now with the vaccines, and it seems to me that this paradigm that we're in, this sort of evidence-based paradigm, where so much focus is placed on large-scale clinical trials and the value of large-scale clinical trials on very narrow outcomes. Be they hard endpoints, but they're narrow outcomes, and at the end of the day, we conduct them, and we're still here talking about that we don't have a good grasp of the reality of this virus. And if this paradigm is not shifting the attention away from doing research on biology, physiology, and whatnot in a little more depth. Again, a couple of episodes ago, we had Paul Merrick on the show talking about vitamin C and his rationale, and he was talking about all the biologically plausible mechanisms for why it would work and whatnot. And then the clinical trials are disappointing, and then he has his own reasons as to why they were disappointing. So I'm not saying that he's correct or not correct, but I can see why. I mean, I can see that vitamin C might be helpful for a subset of people, and when you put things in the clinical trial, then you wash off the and then you prevent an accumulation of knowledge at the biological level that eventually ends up being helpful. And so in all these things, you have this mechanism, this mRNA mechanism, you test it, then immediately we go to the clinical trial, right? And then there's nothing in between to try to refine our understanding of the infection, of the biology of the vaccine and whatnot. And in fact, the pharmaceutical companies are disincentivized from looking any further, right? Once the trial is positive, then that's it.
Right.
There's not going to be any more research.
You bring up an interesting point, and I think it actually ties into what I was saying about the trials and how they weren't stratified to, or at least targeted towards those that might have been most likely to benefit from the vaccine. It's a similar notion.
Correct.
It gets washed out. And if you're not, it's like a classic example is, steroids for back pain. At the population level, they don't do anything. And yet it's still very common practice for neurosurgeons on down to the average emergency physician to prescribe steroids to certain people, because if they benefit, they benefit. The harm is low.
That's a very, very good point. That's exactly right, because I've had exactly that experience of giving steroids to people with very severe cervical, radiculopathy, and it works immediately. And there's no way you could convince me that it didn't work for that patient, me or that patient.
Exactly.
Right?
And at the population level, you would have to say, no, it doesn't work.
Right.
So it's these are funny things, and so just going to your point that you brought up, Anish, about people who are pure data side who come to clinical issues, they don't have this insight.
Mm-hmm.
They don't have this insight. And also, I would say that this applies in a lot of different ways. So people who spend their life doing regression, who've never gone back to sort of probability, for example, and thought about it probabilistically, thought about problems probabilistically, are often blinded by what they're doing behind that veneer of Stata or SAS or whatever they're using. So I can give you a very simple example, and we can talk about, just when I was watching your conversation with Dr. Abeluk and Professor Abeluk, and it was interesting and it was long, but what struck me is that if I had a coin, regular unbiased coin, and I were to flip that coin 1,000 times, the vast majority of outcomes, and I were to repeat that experiment over and over again, the vast majority of outcomes would fall in the interval of 480 to 520 heads. The probability mass would be accumulated there by far and away. I can narrow that a little. 490 to 510, an even larger proportion of the mass exists in there. So when, Abeluk is talking about, let's not focus on the raw numbers. This is what the regression shows. If we take the model and we have some assumptions around this and project it out there, I'm like, every significance experiment can actually be reduced to a coin toss, because the null hypothesis is a coin toss. It's an unbiased coin. And you can reconstruct the significance testing with multiple tosses. And when you perform this experiment, let's look at this, the mask experiment. You have, I think, 1086 versus 1106. So, 2106, whatever, tosses of the coin. Would you be truly surprised if I asked you to toss an unbiased coin 2106 times and there was a 20 difference between heads and tails? Would you be surprised?
Right. Of course not. Of
No.
course not. And that's very interesting. It's exactly, the last 2 episodes were a conversation that I had with Michael Acree on a book that he wrote called The Myth of Statistical Inference. And it's exactly what we're talking about. And in fact, he makes the point that the replication crisis is not a crisis. It's it's baked into the statistical inference procedure. And then if we focus on these, if all our attention is focused on the p-value and the whatnot, and we completely miss the point.
Yeah.
And definitely when you have a very small result like this, there's no question that it's going to be indicative that the effect is very close to the null hypothesis. And,
But it goes to show you that the upset of academia on things like this, it goes to show you that there's something wrong at the very core there, because I'm telling you right now, academia, they are far more interested in the process and going through and doing all the right steps that, their little elite club has said, these are the rules, play by these rules. And if you play by these rules, you will win, right? And so the fact that you could do a 600 village, 300,000 patient cluster study in Bangladesh, that's what's important. The fact that you pre-registered, that's what's important. You could pre-register like complete garbage. You could not be able to answer why exactly you selected this analysis versus another analysis. But the important thing is that you pre-registered it. It's like this chess game. It's just you play by the rules. You play by the rules, and you ignore the fact, and you get some outcome, and you ignore the fact that your effect size is 20. Like if you flip those 1,000 coins, right, and you got some huge difference, right? You got 300 heads.
That's that's an unbiased coin, right?
Right.
That's a biased
coin.
Well,
yeah, right. But yes, but if you got 300, then there would be no question about, nobody would be talking about, well, I don't know, statistical model, blah, blah. So, it's this idea that, Ben Recht said it, Michael Acree, said it, and you're saying something like, it's the, we're kind of losing everything if we forget about the effect size. But God forbid you talk to, an academic who does trials about the final effect size you end up with, and then it makes you really think. It's like, holy crap, what is everything? Like if our world is built on these things.
We know that at least my rule of thumb is when I read a paper that never cites absolute risk while telling me all about the relative risk, I know some chicanery is going on, almost always.
Right.
And I have to dig into it.
Right.
But what you said about, what's accepted in academia or not, it's kind of why I stopped publishing. I mean, I was doing heavily quantitative stuff with optimization equations and microsimulation. And when I would try and publish it to if I published that in operations research, if I published that in medical informatics or someplace, it's not going to get the readership when it's really going at a fundamental clinical decision situation, which was what it was. So for me to get it to an audience, a lot of it had to be stripped away. It's like, well, this is all just a model. And I say that making fun of models for the last 2 years, by the way, but it was a model. But the difference is that it turned out to be right, right? So like 10 years down the line, as clinical trials are run on it, it was the correct approach. And I can say that if you approach things mathematically in a rigorous fashion, and you look at it in multiple different ways, and they are convergent, it usually means you've arrived at the truth. And it's that convergence that's really important.
So you did switch on, you thought your opinion on masks,
Yeah.
what you think about masks, how effective they are, and what we should be doing with them now.
I mean, I live in an area where I go work out with a mask. There's 30-foot ceilings. There's like 6 of us in this large room, this, group fitness setting, and my mask is soaked with sweat. I'm constantly having to hold it off of my mouth with my tongue. So while I'm, my heart rate's pumping away in the 160s to 170s, what am I doing? Right? That's not, there's nothing scientific around that. I'm basically being waterboarded by this mask, so I'm breathing around it. It's clearly not doing what I was going to say what it's supposed to do, but I don't even think there's an intent there. I think it's just all this symbolism and nothing more. I don't mind wearing a mask at work, whatever. It gets a little annoying. It hurts behind my ears a little bit. I have a little mask acne that comes and goes, but whatever. Right. Ultimately, that's not the big deal. But, when you start talking about, well, now it becomes a reason for people to rage. So now that we're seeing breakthrough infections, it's kind of like, I don't, I'm an ER doc. I swear a lot. Am I allowed to swear on this show?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So like, now we're seeing breakthrough infections, and, it's like, fuck my life. People are like, well, now why aren't you asking me? It's like, oh my God, didn't we let go of this? It's like, you have vaccines and you can even have distancing, but now we're coming back to masking. Are you serious?
Correct. I mean, the mask thing is what convinces me that this is really psychological warfare. There's no way with the vaccines you could say, okay, there may be some, plausibility to people believing that it's going to make a difference in the pandemic. But with the vaccines, with the masks, it's pure psychological warfare.
I mean, you've seen what I've said, Anish, multiple times. I said there's a weak to nil effect. I haven't said there's no effect. I'd said this evidence most supports a weak to nil effect. And actually, what I'm also willing to say from like looking at other papers is that it may actually be biasing to certain forms of illness that might be a bit worse. We don't really know. We don't know this. And what's really interesting about the mask literature is you look at someone like Ben Cowling, who I'm probably going to hear from his lawyer because I mentioned his name. But anyway, this amazing professor in Hong Kong who's done all these fascinating studies on aerosols, ran household RCT for masks, surgical masks and hand hygiene in Hong Kong, did secondary analysis on that trial, plus the Bangkok trials for the same, all with influenza, did some interesting literature that was published, sometime this year, I think in the middle of this year, looking at exhaled breath, viral loads at different particle sizes through a particle size filter, looking at less than 1 micrometer and above. Really interesting stuff. Who has literature that falls on both sides of the question. And so, what I say to people is that if there's effect, it's a weak effect. If it was anything more than a weak effect, you wouldn't get repeated trials, repeated experiments falling on either side of the null hypothesis over and over and over again.
Right. Not only that, but I mean, I think it's clearly a question that cannot. I mean, it's the fallacy of scientism. It's looking for the scientific method to answer a question that really cannot be answered scientifically, because everything that you're going to do in a lab is going to be very rigorous and mitigated and whatnot. And even if you do it in a household, you're going to give the household instructions about how to wear the mask and whatnot.
Right.
Whereas in real life, there's no way you can, right? I mean, there's no way. So you cannot possibly, right, infer from the scientific data sets, what's going to happen in real life. You have to understand. I mean, you can understand the question on masks just based on knowing that viruses are transported by little tiny droplets, and masks are kind of porous things.
Yeah.
And they can maybe, I mean, it is a semi barrier, and that's all you can know, and that's all you need to know.
It's attenuating.
Right.
Now, whether or not it's attenuating enough to get below some minimal infectious dose, you can't know. Even studies that look at what's the minimal infectious dose of influenza, for example, their estimates are off by 3 to 4 orders of magnitude, right? So it's like there isn't the kind of precision here that everyone thinks there is. And Michelle, you said you're in the Bay Area. You know what it's like around here in terms of masking. You know what it was like last year through winter. In the Avalok study, they're talking about getting 60% compliance. Are you kidding me? What were we at? I never walked into a store and saw anyone without a mask.
Exactly.
I don't know about you.
Right.
But
Absolutely.
When we started having our wave and our explosion, and that's the same was true down in LA and Southern California, et cetera, until, all the Trumpers in Orange County decided to stop. But that's until then, everyone was on the same page, and we had our wave. And I remember speaking to one of my physicians. I'm like, do you see how all of this stuff we're doing, it probably isn't making
for sure
impact.
Very
I have to tell you the answer I got. This guy, he's an excellent physician. I deeply respect him. He's a friend. He's a smart guy. And he's like, yeah, I just wish people would wear them at home. And I just was like, I have no hair to grab, but I wanted to grab my hair.
That's funny. But Tom Woods, a podcaster, not a doctor, he's done very great stuff during the pandemic. He has a slide set, or he put a talk where he shows all the states and
I've seen it. Yeah.
Right, where the mask mandates was introduced, and there's absolutely no correlation with what the epidemic does. I mean, absolutely none. So, and that's all really you need to know. I mean, you don't need to know anything more.
The answer now we have the final answer from Bangladesh, so we don't have to.
All right, I want to talk about the flu. Viral. You had a great. I mean, something that really startled me, because everybody's been puzzling about how come there's no flu. There was no flu. All kinds of theories. Tell us why there is no flu. With Corona. Yeah, go ahead.
In the spirit of not being what I detest, I don't know.
Okay.
What I can tell you is that the notion that there's just a bunch of different things you need to start looking at. So, for example, if you look at FluNet, which is a WHO resource, you can't look at Taiwan on there, by the way, but that's another topic. But anyway, if you look at the different countries and you look throughout the Asian countries in terms of what their flu waves have looked like since the original SARS epidemic, and when masking and hand hygiene became more of a religion in those areas, you don't really see much of a signal, even though reporting may have changed and maybe certain other things may have changed, but they're largely internally consistent. You don't see much of a signal. Then on top of that...
But when you say not much of a signal, you mean that they haven't had big flu...
They haven't had a big reduction in influenza.
Oh, big reduction. Okay.
And then when 2009 H1N1 hit, they got hit hard.
Okay.
More so than the U.S. From what I recall. But looking at the numbers, that's clearly the case. I mean, if it was mitigated, then my God, I don't know what I wonder what it would have been like unmitigated, because it looked pretty bad. And it took about 3 years for those amplitudes to decrease. Again, this sort of 3-year cycle thing is a repeated motif. Which would be interesting to look at mathematically, but that's a separate topic. But anyway, then on top of that, of course, you probably saw last year the Lancet paper on viral interference, where people theorized that a rhinoviral infection basically ended the H1N1 pandemic in this country. And we actually weren't impacted anywhere near as severely as many other countries, where we have more pediatric deaths than usual by quite a bit. But outside of that, we didn't do as badly as a lot of nations did. And basically demonstrating in a tissue model that being previously infected with this rhinovirus decreased susceptibility of that tissue model to influenza, subsequent influenza infection. So, viral interference is this thing. It's kind of like seasonality, in that there's some quasi-scientific basis to it, but the fact that everyone understands exactly how it works is not a correct statement. So, I look at that as one data point. I look at the stuff that you get off FluNet as the other data point. And if we do believe, as there's no reason not to believe, that this originated in China, ultimately 85 to 90% of flu strains come from China and Southeast Asia. The remaining percentage, Indian subcontinent, and they spread from there. So if viral interference is really a thing, if you have a virus that's circulating around when flu needs to be generated in its site of origin, and people theorize as to all the reasons why they originate there. It's a combination of humans being near animals and the conditions, et cetera, et cetera. And again, no one knows. So if it stops there and it doesn't spread, there's nothing to spread. So what was interesting this year is that really the only flu signal that you could see was in the Indian subcontinent. And you got a little bit in South Africa, and lo and behold, it's out again. Right, we're seeing quite a bit now. When I say quite a bit, it's not a huge amount, but of course, these aren't peak flu months yet, right? We're going to wait a month or two for that. So, yeah, it's interesting. I go back to my original answer, which is a short answer, which is I don't know, but there's lots of reasons to suspect, from virion size to viral aerosol size, that it's got nothing to do with our mitigations. The virion size is about the same.
Mm-hmm.
So if the flu comes back,
yeah,
that means that COVID is dead.
Well, I mean that's kind of the theory, right? Like, meaning that some people have looked and said the return of flu suggests that COVID is not circulating as widely. There isn't as much viral interference, right. And what we're seeing, I don't know, is what we're seeing in South Africa consistent with that? Yeah. I don't know.
And so, just to be sure, you're not saying that the flu coming from, usually coming from China, is that the Wuhan lab has been operating for the last 100 years, and right. Every year, ever since the Boxer Rebellion, they've been releasing, letting loose a new strain of.
Well, I mean, let's be honest. We've had flu for 40 years, and Fauci has been in power for 40 years.
Right.
Coincidence?
I don't think so.
So we're gonna put Viral on the spot for the last few minutes here, because he's been so good at predicting that lockdowns or travel bans were kind of useless. Masks, probably not that effective, or minimally effective at most. Not the pandemic killers that some people think it is. So he's got a great track record. So we're gonna put him on the spot with some burning questions now. All right. So. Omicron has made an emergence. We skipped right over Xi because we don't want to upset
him,
the Chinese premier. But some people say, some very smart people, smart in quotations, who have massive followings, who end up on CNN all the time. So not the three of us. Here are some things the Biden administration should do right now, and I want your comments on these to see, and we'll see how you do compared to what this gentleman is suggesting.
Yeah.
Require vaccinations for all domestic airline passengers. Yay or nay?
Nay. Airlines are some of the safest places to be. I mean, their filtration systems are orders of magnitude better than any office or your car or whatever. So no.
And don't you want to stop it spreading domestically? Viral? I mean, what the heck?
No, actually, no, I don't. Actually, no. We've tried that. It doesn't do well. So
doesn't do well. Yeah. Okay, so no for that. This is a harder one. Well, let's see. I mean, I'm gonna withhold comment because this is your show. Make rapid tests.
This is fun.
Make rapid tests free and widely available.
Oh my God. So I have to open with back in February of 2020, I sat down and I kind of thought about, I just did some sort of back of the hand sort of calculation, just like doing like a binomial expansion and looking at the asymptomatic rates. Track and trace was just seemed like a farce from the get-go. So if this is more of the same, I mean, again, what are we trying to stop? I don't get it. I don't.
Yeah, I think no, we're not trying to stop anything. In fact, we're trying to perpetuate the pandemic ad infinitum.
I see, right. I mean, you know what? Let me look at some companies I want to take some stock in, and then I'll answer that question.
All right. So no to rapid free. I mean, again, from a rapid free test, I mean, I get it. I get why it feels good, but like literally, you have to figure out what to do with these rapid tests.
Yeah.
Even the false positive rate being X, whatever it is, and it's not going to be zero.
Just remember, like right now, if you were to use rapid tests in Florida, where the incidence is like just some ridiculously low number,
right?
We'll have more false positives than true positives by far and away.
Exactly. So then, you're talking massive disruptions of people's lives. What are you going to do? You're going to take those people and keep them home for 14 days or 10 days. Yeah. Based on, I mean, and that's not a small thing. So the people that are okay with those, we had a test positive and we're going to stay home 10 days. They work in large corporations where, they're spending 6 months of the time sitting at home on their laptop making, $200,000 a year. They're like, oh, what's 10 days? I mean, you're talking about 10 days off for like somebody who's making $30,000, $40,000 a year, and their small employer is like, sorry, this is going to be pretty difficult. This is not as easy as people think pragmatically. Then, of course, the folks would then respond with like, oh, just helicopter money, just dump, just money, just send them some money. It's like, yeah, that has no downstream consequences. In 10 months time, that same person now has to spend, 50% more for their grocery bill versus what they were doing before. Not a regressive tax at all to print really money endlessly.
Interesting about the cost thing is even if you're not hitting it big on groceries, they're really simple things. Oh, hi. They're really simple things like, I'm not even kidding. Like the cost of a pickup truck. I was talking to a contractor the other day, and he said basically like the cost of pickup trucks is through the roof.
Right.
Supply chain issues and inflation.
Yeah. Inflation. Yeah.
And he needs it for work. He needs it for work.
Right. And this idea that you can just, you just raise the marginal tax rate to pay for it, and you're just being an a-hole because you're a rich guy that doesn't want your marginal tax rate raised. It's like, even if I was okay with giving the government, 20% more of my income because, the government is so awesome, it could be shown fantastic track record in the last 18 months in terms of doing the right thing. Even if we were to do that, it's Congress. Congress doesn't get anything done. What is the chances they're going to be able to push through a 10% increase in taxes without like giving some massive deduction? It's just such a silly thing that doesn't make any sense. Okay, last one. Redefine fully vaccinated as 3 mRNA doses or J&J plus 1.
I mean, I'm going to be consistent here and say no. I mean, where's the evidence for stopping transmission? What is the goal of redefining vaccination? Ultimately, it's about risk mitigation and individual risk. Systems aren't overwhelmed. We have hospitals for a reason. We don't need to define vaccinated.
Excellent. It's worth mentioning that just another preprint that just came out from Canada, actually, everyone but the CDC apparently putting out something that's good. If you vaccinate and you do Pfizer and then Moderna in young men, that rate of having myocarditis, I know we're uber focused on myocarditis because we're cardiologists and
that's all good,
making everyone else upset, is so much higher. I mean, it's 770 per million versus, I mean, so, and that's what you can do right now. There's no nuance on any of this coming out from anyone in terms of, one dose, short interval, long interval, etc. But, we're left to your own devices and following folks like Viral and a bunch of other smart folks on here. All right. Well, Viral, we've spent way too much of your time on this this afternoon. So thanks so much for coming on. Please give us your Twitter handle so the 10 followers of this podcast can. No, I'm kidding. Can also follow you
at Contrarian for Data.
Oh my goodness, that's good. At Contrarian for Data. Excellent. Excellent. All right. Well, thanks so much. Michelle, any last words?
Right. No, that's it. That was great. Thank you.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks so much.
Guys. Nice meeting you. Take care.
Yep.
Bye-bye.